Hello students, welcome to the video lecture series organized under Gyandoot program initiated by Department of College Education, Government of Rajasthan. I am Dr. Kiran, Associate Professor in English. Today in this lecture, I am going to talk about a very famous, influential English poet, William Wordsworth, who is known as the harbinger of Romanticism in English literature. Students, this lecture is divided into 4 parts. In the first part, there will be a brief biographical sketch of the poet to have an understanding about the places where he lived and also about the people with whom he interacted throughout his life and also the people who played an important role in shaping his poetic career. In the second part of the lecture, we will try to trace Wordsworth's journey as a poet. In the third part, there will be a quick overview of his theory of poetry. And in the last part of the lecture, we will discuss the salient features of Wordsworth's poetry with special reference to his famous poems, The Solitary Reaper, The World is Too Much With Us, 3 Years She Grew, and Tintern Abbey. So students, let's get started. Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1770 at Cockermouth, Cumberland. He died on April 23, 1850 at Riddlemount. His parents were John Wordsworth and Anne Cookson. His sister was Dorothy Wordsworth and his wife was his childhood friend Mary Hutchinson, whom he married in 1802, and his friend S.T. Coleridge, who played very important role in his journey, in his growth as a poet, whom he met in 1795. Wordsworth lost his parents when he was a child, so he spent his early childhood with his maternal grandparents at Penrith. This was the place from where he started his education. He began with Anne Birkett's infant school at Penrith. Later on, he joined grammar school at Hawkshead, where he studied from 1778 to 1787. After completion of his school education, Wordsworth joined St. John's College, Cambridge, where he studied 1787 to 1791. When he was a student at St. John's College, he went on a walking tour to Europe in 1790, and this tour influenced a lot and it played an important role in shaping his ideology. This was the tour when he got influenced by the French Revolution during his trip to France. And 1 year after this walking tour, he went to France again in 1791. And the third important tour is that of Germany, where he went with his sister Dorothy and he stayed there from 1798 to 1799. And the fourth place is Scotland. His visits to Scotland played a very influential role in shaping and sharpening his poetic sensibilities as a nature poet, and he visited this place in 1803, 1814 and third time in 1831. In 1795, Wordsworth settled at Racedown in Dorsetshire with his sister Dorothy. This was the year when Wordsworth met Coleridge, and to stay close to Coleridge, Wordsworth shifted to Alfoxden, a place near Netherstowey, which was the residence of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Later on, he shifted to Dove Cottage at Grasmere, and in the last years of his life, he spent at Riddlemount, Westmoreland. Students, Here, my point is to make you people familiar with the very location which was geographical location which was close to his heart, and that is Lake District. Lake District, its surroundings, its natural landscape was an inspiration for him as a poet of nature. And just because of his close association with Lake District, he is called Lake Poet along with Coleridge and Robert Southey. Wordsworth started his journey as a poet with the publication of his first sonnet in the European magazine in 1787 when he was a student. Later on, he penned down his observations of his surroundings and along with the descriptive sketches of the places which he visited with his sister Dorothy and with his friend St. Coleridge. And all his observations are recorded in his poems, which are collected in descriptive sketches and an evening walk. And these collections were published in 1797 and they were written during 1790 to 1791. The second phase of his journey as a poet begins in 1792. The period from 1792 and 1796 is also called a period of gloom because this was the time when William Wordsworth lost his two brothers and his sister was seriously ill, and moreover he was also passing through financial crisis, and this was the time he wrote these poems of guilt and sorrow and the ruined cottage, which which are centered on the themes of despair and depression. And after 1796, a, a boom comes in his growth as a poet with the publication of his great a path-breaking collection of poems, the Lyrical Ballads. And with the publication of Lyrical Ballad, the glorious decade of his poetic career begins. And this was the time when he got published his famous collection, a series of 5 poems, Lucy poems. And this was the time when he started writing an autobiographical poem, The Prelude. And lastly, from 1808 and 1850, he kept on working on this autobiographical poem, The Prelude, and along with many other short lyrics, he worked on the volume, The Excursion, which was published in 1814. This is in brief about the 4 stages of Wordsworth's journey as a poet, and here as we have discussed that the glorious decade 1797 to 1807 is the very important phase of his poetic career. So we will talk in detail about the poems which were published and written during this time. The very important creative project which William Wordsworth started during this golden decade is his long autobiographical poem, which he started writing in 1798, and the first draft was completed by 1805. And throughout his life, Wordsworth kept on making additions, changes to this long poem, and it was published posthumously in 1850 by his wife Mary Hutchinson, and it was his wife only who gave this autobiographical poem the title The Prelude. During this golden decade, the another important work which published was a series of 5 poems which are also known as Lucy poems. And these poems were written during Wordsworth's stay at Germany with his sister Dorothy. These 5 poems are 3 years she grew in sun and shower, she dwelt among the untrodden ways. The third one is strange fits of passion have I known. Fourth one is I travelled among unknown men. And the fifth of the series is a slumber did my spirit seal. The third important work, which was composed and published during the Golden Decade, is lyrical ballads, which is called the path-breaking um, work in the literary history of England. This was the collection which Wordsworth published in collaboration with Coleridge, and in this collection there are 23 poems in all. 19 are written by Wordsworth and 4 by Coleridge. The first poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, was composed by Coleridge, and the last poem of the collection is Tintern Abbey, written by Wordsworth. We will talk in detail about this lyrical ballad as a path-breaking work, as a work which initiated Romanticism in English literature. Here, one important thing which is to be mentioned, that during this decade, in 1843, William Wordsworth was appointed as the Poet Laureate of England. Now let's have a quick overview of Wordsworth's theory of poetry and poetic diction, which is recorded in his preface to lyrical ballads, which he wrote in 1800. And this very document, the preface to lyrical ballads, is declared as an official manifesto of Romanticism. This is the document where Wordsworth gave his own definition of poetry, which shows a move, a transition from the objective poetry of neoclassical age. He defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, which takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. Through this very idea, this very concept of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, Wordsworth explained his, his theory about how the poetic process takes place, which can be explained in terms of 4 phases. That first one is the observation, that a creative artist, a poet, how a creative artist or a poet observes his surroundings. Then the next stage is of recollection, means after a later period of time, that creative artist is recollecting, remembering those very observation, and during that phase of recollection, spontaneously or naturally a sort of filtration takes place, means some imagination is poured into that real life experience which he has observed earlier, and now he's recollecting. And in this very process of filtration, a new composition takes place. So this is how Wordsworth looked at the poetic process. And this was the document, the preface to lyrical ballads, where Wordsworth declared that poetry is the breath and the finer spirit of all knowledge. He gave this much importance to poetry. Students, this document is declared the official manifesto of Romanticism because Wordsworth declared the shift or the move of poetry from objectivity to subjectivity, from the realm of thought to the realm of emotions. But at the same time, this very document declared his revolt against the language, the diction which was used in neoclassical poetry. This document declared Wordsworth's revolt against the inane and gaudy, the decorative diction of the neoclassical age. It talks about, preface talks about the language of poetry is a selection of the real language of men. Means it talks about the use of the language which is used by the common people, the humble and rustic crowd, which according to Wordsworth forms the central role uh, in the contents of a poem. So students, now let's talk about salient features of Wordsworth's poetry. By now you have a clear idea. स्टूडेंट्स अभी आपके सामने एक क्लियर आइडिया है कि किस तरह से वर्ड्सवर्थ ने अपना बचपन, अपनी पूरी लाइफ नेचुरल सराउंडिंग्स में, कंट्री साइड में स्पेंड की, नंबर 1। नंबर 2, अपनी राइटिंग्स में, अपनी पोएम्स में उसने एम्फेसाइज किया कि जो पोएम का कंटेंट है वो थॉट नहीं, इमोशंस होना चाहिए। वहां पे लाइफ के लिए एक ऑब्जेक्टिव अप्रोच नहीं, सब्जेक्टिव अप्रोच होनी चाहिए। और दूसरी इंपॉर्टेंट बात कि ये जो थॉट से इमोशन का शिफ्ट है, तो नेचुरली जो लैंग्वेज है वो भी आर्टिफिशियल से नेचुरल की तरफ जाएगी। तो द रियल लैंग्वेज के यूज पे उसने एम्फेसाइज किया। ये सब हम अब तक बात कर चुके हैं। तो इससे ये दो चीजें क्लियर होती हैं कि वर्ड्सवर्थ is a great poet as far as the nature poetry is concerned. And the second one is that he is an eminent romantic poet because he revolted against the established order for the content and the language of poetry during the neoclassical period. So now first let's have a look at the traits of romanticism which we can find in Wordsworth poetry. The first one is spontaneity and simplicity. The second one is revolt against artificiality, as we have discussed that how he has made clear in his preface to lyrical ballads that the inane and gaudy phraseology has no place in poetry. The language of the poetry should be the real language. Then the love for nature, and above all, the love for humanity. Wordsworth was aware of the dignity of an individual. So these are the traits of romanticism, along with the mood of melancholy is also there in some of his poems. So these traits prove that how Wordsworth has incorporated the elements of romanticism in his poetry. Let's first talk about his love for nature, because the portrayal of nature or a close relationship with nature is the very important trait of romantic poetry. And moreover, Wordsworth is also called the high priest of nature. This is all because that in Wordsworth poetry we find a spiritual veneration for nature, a spiritual adoration for nature. Generally what happens when we talk about a nature poet, we feel that there will be the picturesque description of natural landscape. No doubt the same is there in Wordsworth's poems, but Wordsworth is not concerned only about the physical beauty of the landscape. He is concerned about, he is deeply attached to a living presence in that very surrounding. So that is the magic of Wordsworth's nature poetry. That's why he is called a mystic poet also, because he finds a living presence. There is a spiritual adoration for nature in his poems. The, the very famous and often quoted sonnet, "The world is too much with us." I hope you are all familiar with this sonnet, that how this sonnet shows or expresses Wordsworth's deep concern and his disgust with the growing materialism, that he pathetically says that little we see in nature that is ours. This is the irony of the contemporary life also. And in the closing part of this poem, he declares or he wishes that he wants to be a pagan, means he wants to go back to the uh, primitive years of human civilization. He wants to be a pagan, he wants to be a nature worshipper. The another important poem is Tintern Abbey, which depicts Wordsworth's love for nature. This is an autobiographical poem which presents before us Wordsworth as a worshipper of nature. This poem depicts Wordsworth's move as a poet of nature from physical to spiritual. This is a poem which uh, familiarizes us with Wordsworth, the mystic poet. Because in this very poem, Wordsworth is not talking about only the beauty of the natural surroundings. He is giving expression to his realization of a living presence in nature which works as a guide for him. Here I would like to quote from this very poem that Wordsworth addresses nature as the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. And moreover, this very poem depicts his deep faith in nature, that when he declares that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. It's a privilege through all the years of this our life to lead from joy to joy. So this is how this beautiful poem presents spiritual veneration for nature. Another poem which I would like to discuss is 3 Years She Grew in Sun and Shower, which is one of the Lucy poems. And this poem talks about the education of nature. This poem talks about the formative influence of nature on the personality of the little girl Lucy. So through this influence, through this association of Lucy with nature, and that how nature grooms Lucy's personality. It presents the close bond between nature and man, which Wordsworth has attempted to highlight in his poems. Now, the another important characteristic of romanticism, which is which we find in Wordsworth poetry, is imagination. So what it is? Actually, imagination is the revelation of a sense of mystery and uncommon in common objects. That's what Wordsworth has so beautifully done. Since our school days, as students of literature, we are all familiar with his beautiful poem Daffodils, that how the mesmerizing description of the daffodils is there in this poem when Wordsworth says, 10,000 I saw at a glance, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance. The third important trait of his poetry is love for humanity. No doubt he is a poet of nature, but it doesn't mean that he is not talking about man. He is talking about nature man in relation to in relationship with nature. The bond or the interaction of nature and man is his key concern. And it is only after the influence of because of the influence of the French Revolution that he is so concerned about humanity. The still sad music of humanity, as he says in Tintern Abbey, vibrates in his poems. And fourthly, the note of melancholy, which is another important feature of romantic poetry is also there in his poems, as we have see if you have read his poem The Solitary Reaper, that in the closing lines of the poem, Wordsworth talks about that how that the sweet song of that lonely highland girl is echoing in his mind, although it is heard no more. He says, the music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more. Now, after the contents, the another important thing which is to be discussed when we talk about uh, the poetry of a particular poet, that is language and style. The subject matter, the contents, the concerns of Wordsworth poetry make it clear to us that his poetry is all based on spontaneity and simplicity. So the same, it is it is so because the language which is used there is in tune with that very simplicity and spontaneity, and it is all because of his emphasis on the selection of language actually spoken by human beings. Students, although there is a little controversy about this thing, that on one hand Wordsworth is talking about the language actually spoken by a human being, and the same time he is talking about some selection of the language, means he is talking about some purification of the real language for the poetry. So this is another can be the another topic of discussion. Here our main concern is to know that being a harbinger of romanticism, he um, shifted the world of poetry from the artificial diction of the neoclassical age to the natural language. And uh, here I would like to quote the great poet Matthew Arnold, that how beautifully he has commented about the style and language of Wordsworth. He says, nature herself seems to take the pen out of his hand to write for him with her own bare, sheer, and penetrating power. How beautiful! This is the magic of Wordsworth, that every word which is written by Wordsworth is tuned with the meaning, is tuned with the thought, is tuned with the feeling which he wants to convey. So, student, this is all in brief about Wordsworth and his journey as a poet, who is rightly called a mountain, the most massive in that lofty range which is called the Romantic Revival. Students, keep reading Wordsworth's poem, keep exploring more this great worshipper of nature, this high priest of nature. This poem, his collection of poetry has very mesmerizing descriptions for you with very meaningful messages to be in tune with the nature, to be close to nature. So keep reading Wordsworth and keep enjoying the world of nature. Thank you.